Okay, in this video, we are going to be talking about open materials and how they contribute to open science. So open materials are, no, okay. All right, in this video, we are going to be talking about open materials and how they contribute to open science. So the idea behind open materials is that researchers share the materials that they use for their research study, all the way from, experiment creation, stimuli, programming, through data analysis. So why would you want to share your experimental program, the stimuli that you use? What benefit does that give you or science? Well, one of the benefits of it is that it allows others to evaluate if the stimuli that you use are good and appropriate for your research question. So this is an example from my research. And so I was able to base one of my studies off of a previous study, and I asked the authors, and they were able to send me the stimuli that they used in their study. So this is what they had.
Ong Lors, Alt Gelshri,
Alt Drac, Ong Masgrin.
Okay, so yes, those words were made up, maybe a little bit strange, but there also wasn't a lot of fluidity to it. It was kind of choppy and maybe not super natural for children to be listening to. So these stimuli aren't terrible, but they're definitely not as good as they could be. So I was able to improve on kind of how they designed their study and come up with new stimuli that I think are more appropriate for the task at hand. So this is what I came up with.
Gauche, poussette. Gauche, cuisine. Gauche, poche. Gauche, chapeau.
Okay, so obviously that contains some actual words that you might know. And so it's a little bit more naturalistic, it flows a little bit better. And so it's important to share the stimuli with other researchers, not only to make sure that they're appropriate for the research question, but it may also ultimately save time for other researchers who want to do work using the same materials. So instead of having to go through email processes, asking researchers for their materials, waiting for a response, maybe they don't even have them saved on their computers anymore. They're just there on the internet that you can go ahead and download. So it saves time and it saves resources. And then ultimately it could lead to a better replication of the original study if the exact same materials are used. So really important to have stimuli open.
Good.
And then the next component of open materials is open data. So data can take a lot of different forms depending on the type of research that you do, but it's important to share raw data. So this means data that is not processed and not really pared down in any way, but it's kind of exactly what you get from the experimental program, for example. But for example, if you're doing like MRI data where you have just like a ton of data that needs to go through some sort of processing in order to be legible, then it could be appropriate to share the process data in those situations. So when you share your data, you also want to include documentation and descriptions of the data. So different researchers have different conventions for naming variables. So you would want to include what variables actually are, what column names like describe, and this is so others can explore your data. They can run analyses to confirm your results. They could discover new patterns, form new hypotheses. So sharing data can be a really important component of not only confirming what you said, but then allowing others to form new ideas off of your study. Sharing data can also contribute to meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are kind of studies that take data from a bunch of different studies, combine them, and kind of do a study of the studies to see what the true effects are in a given field. So having raw data for that is much easier to use than just some summary statistics in a research article. So sharing data is an important part of open science. Part of sharing data is your data visualizations. So this may be something that not a lot of people think about, but I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this in the last year or so, and it's actually very interesting. So a lot of people will just use bar graphs like this. So when you have a bar graph like this, every single group looks exactly the same. It doesn't look like there are any differences between the groups in looking time, which is the dependent variable. But once you add error bars, which you should learn about in your statistics class, we can see that there's some difference here. So there's a lot of variability happening here in group 3, but not so much happening in group 1. So we can start to see that there are these underlying differences between the groups that aren't apparent here in the first graph. If we change it to a box plot, we get even a more detailed, different picture than just the error bars allow us. However, we're still only seeing summary statistics. What gives you a much better idea of the data is including individual data points. So these are the same groups that we saw on the previous slide, but here we can see that, wow, okay, yeah, these groups are very different, right? We have a unimodal distribution here, a bimodal distribution here, and only 2 people here in this last group. Each group is different, but we never would have known that if we were just looking at this graph here. So how you visualize your data can also give readers a very different picture of the data itself. Okay, and now heading into analyses. So it's really important to share the analysis that you do for your research in order for other people to check to see if the analyses were done correctly. So in order to do this, open source statistical analyses programs are preferred, such as R. R is free, anyone can use it. There's a bit of a learning curve, but if you include an R script with your data, people can then run your R scripts with your data and see what happens for themselves. And R is also great because there's extensive documentation and an online support community. So I would definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't already. Sharing your analyses also allows other people to check for errors. So if you've done any sort of coding, you know that errors happen all the time. And sometimes you don't even know that they happened. One example of this is actually from my supervisor. In her original article, she published this figure using her R code. And then someone else came along, they tried to reproduce the figure, and they noticed that there was a function that she used that slightly changed the output for the graph. And so what she was able to do is she was able to issue a correction on the figure. And then so with that small change in the code, the figure now looks like this over here. What's just important to note here is that this didn't actually change the conclusions of the paper. It just slightly altered the values that were depicted in the figure. So sharing your analyses can allow for this sort of correction. It can be terrifying putting your work out there and letting people look at it, but ultimately the scientific record will be more correct if people can check your work and then potentially correct it, so we have a more concise idea of what is happening in people's minds. So there are a lot of different things, a lot of different materials that you can share. And so you may be asking yourself, okay, but where do I share these things and how much could I share, can I share, should I share? So to answer the where question, there is the open science framework, which I've mentioned before. And this is where a lot of psychologists are now sharing materials from their research studies. So you can create different projects, create different folders in the projects. So you can have a folder for data, a folder for code, a folder for stimuli. And so all of that information can kind of live in one place on the internet, where then you and other researchers can go and reference it. In terms of how much should you share, as much as you can. So sometimes there are ethical concerns, especially if you're worried about people identifying your participants from the data that they provide, or different universities have different ethics procedures. So you kind of have to look at that, but there's often ways to work within the confines of ethics in order to share your materials. You may also just not be super comfortable sharing everything, but I would encourage you, if you go along this open science route, is to share one new thing per project. So maybe the first time you just share your stimuli, maybe the next time you also share your stimuli and your data, maybe the next time you add on the analyses. And so it's an iterative process as people learn how to incorporate open science into their research. So I just want to give you a quick example here of open materials. So this is actually the OSF page for one of my research projects. The link will be on the Moodle page if you want to go explore. You can see here that I have my coding instructions for the data. I have the actual data and my R scripts that I use to analyze the data. You can also find my pre-registration for this study up at the top. And then I also have my preprint available on a preprint server called PSYC Archive. So very open sciencey project, and I would definitely recommend go checking it out just to see how open science, how the open science framework works, and see what an open science project looks like. All right, so that was a lot for sharing materials, but in the next video, we are going to cover collaborations as well as errors and self-correction.